Hey, excuse me, I think that's my seat. Do you mind if I slide in?
Yeah. No, I'm good here.
It's printed on my ticket, window seat.
I like the window, too.
Ma'am, I'd really appreciate it if you let me sit where I'm assigned.
Then ask someone to switch. I'm not moving.
All right.
For Jonathan Hammond, boarding a plane was supposed to be straightforward. Locate your row, store your luggage, settle into your seat. But when he arrived at row 14, he encountered an obstacle he hadn't anticipated. Melissa Hightower. She wasn't just occupying the aisle seat. She was claiming the entire row like it was her exclusive territory. She refused to acknowledge him, refused to make space for him to pass, and made it abundantly clear that she didn't want someone like him sitting in her vicinity. She had no idea that her refusal to move her designer handbag would end with her moving off the aircraft entirely. What you just witnessed was the pinnacle of passenger entitlement. A traveler blocking another traveler from a seat they'd legitimately purchased. You saw the confrontation. Now, we're going to walk you through the complete story and reveal the moment the flight crew decided they'd had enough of her behavior. If you believe everyone deserves to reach their assigned seat without discrimination, hit that subscribe button. Jonathan Hammond had been awake since 5:30 in the morning. At 32 years old, he'd navigated this routine enough times to have it down to a science. Airport by 6:45, through security by 7:30, at the gate by 8:15, boarding by 8:45. This particular Thursday afternoon flight was supposed to transport him home after an exhausting week of back-to-back client presentations across 3 cities. And all he wanted was to rest undisturbed during the 3-hour journey. That's why he'd spent the extra $35 for the window seat. Not because he cared about observing the patchwork of clouds and landscape below, but because the window meant a place to lean his head, a solid boundary between him and the commotion of the aisle, and the blessed possibility of not being jostled by seatmates climbing over him to reach the restroom. He dressed for the occasion in business casual that could transition to comfort. An olive green jacket over a dark gray polo shirt, charcoal slacks, and leather loafers that were broken in enough to feel like second skin. His carry-on was a structured black leather portfolio bag containing his laptop, project files, a tablet, and the mystery novel he'd purchased at the airport bookstore but suspected he wouldn't crack open during the flight. As he stood in the jet bridge with dozens of other passengers, all advancing forward in that distinctive airport choreography of urgency and patience, Jonathan felt the accumulated fatigue of the week settling into his muscles. He wasn't contemplating anything beyond reaching seat 14A, sliding his bag beneath the seat ahead of him, resting his head against that small oval window, and shutting out the world until touchdown. The aircraft was precisely what he'd expected. A conventional economy cabin with that characteristic aroma of filtered air, industrial cleaner, and the subtle mustiness of countless previous flights. The seats were covered in that ubiquitous blue-gray fabric engineered to camouflage wear and tear. The overhead compartments already partially filled with the luggage of passengers who'd boarded in earlier groups. Jonathan progressed down the aisle with his boarding pass readily accessible, maneuvering around a couple wrestling with an oversized duffel bag, past a teenager with headphones completely absorbed in his phone, through the inevitable congestion that always seemed to materialize around row 9 for inexplicable reasons. Row 14 was situated in the middle section of the aircraft, in that zone where the ambient engine noise would be noticeable but not overwhelming, and where boarding was often less chaotic because fewer passengers were vying for the same overhead storage. As Jonathan approached, he could see his row materializing ahead. His window seat was conspicuously unoccupied. The middle seat was likewise empty, but the aisle seat was inhabited by a woman who had established herself with remarkable thoroughness for someone who'd only been aboard for perhaps 15 minutes. Melissa Hightower appeared to be in her late 20s, dressed in upscale casual attire. A cream-colored sweater that looked expensive, designer jeans, and white sneakers that had clearly never seen actual athletic activity. She had positioned herself in seat 14C with the assurance of someone who'd already determined this row belonged to her. Her designer handbag, one of those brands with prominent logos, occupied the middle seat like a claim marker. Her lightweight jacket was arranged across the back of that same seat. Her legs were extended into the aisle at a casual angle, her feet propped against the support structure of the seat ahead. She was absorbed in her phone with the deliberate indifference of someone intentionally tuning out the boarding activity surrounding her. Jonathan reached his row and paused, adjusting the strap of his portfolio bag across his shoulder. The aisle behind him was accumulating with other passengers, all eager to locate their seats and secure their belongings. He glanced at the row numbers on the overhead bin to verify, though his boarding pass had already confirmed everything he needed to know. 14A window seat. His seat. The seat he'd paid a premium for. The seat that required navigating past the woman currently treating row 14 as her private sanctuary. He offered what he intended as a courteous, approachable smile, the kind of expression you present to strangers in confined spaces when you're about to request a small accommodation. He gestured toward the window seat and politely informed her that 14A was his assigned seat, asking if she would mind allowing him to access it. Melissa glanced up from her phone, and her eyes moved from his face down to his extended hand pointing toward the window, then back up to meet his gaze. Her expression transformed almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that someone less fatigued might have registered and interpreted immediately. She regarded him for a moment longer than felt natural, then redirected her attention to her phone. She responded dismissively that she was fine where she was. Her legs remained exactly where they'd been, creating a barrier to the middle and window seats. Jonathan experienced a flutter of bewilderment. Perhaps she'd misunderstood him. Perhaps she thought he was inquiring whether she was comfortable, not requesting access to his assigned seat. He adjusted his stance, conscious that people behind him were being forced to halt and wait. He clarified that he meant he needed to get to his seat, explaining that it was clearly indicated on his ticket that he had the window seat assignment. Melissa surveyed the vacant window seat, then looked back at Jonathan, her expression unaltered. She stated matter-of-factly that she preferred having the extra space, as though this preference somehow nullified the fact that the seat had been purchased by someone else. She shifted marginally in her seat, but only to settle herself more comfortably, not to create passage for him. Jonathan felt the exhaustion in his shoulders suddenly intermingling with something else. Incredulity. He'd encountered challenging fellow passengers before. The person who reclines aggressively into your lap, the person who monopolizes both armrests, the person whose child treats your seat back as a drum. But he'd never encountered someone who outright refused to permit him access to his legitimately assigned seat. He inhaled slowly, maintaining his composure, and attempted once more. He told her respectfully that he would genuinely appreciate it if she would allow him to sit in his assigned location. Melissa finally looked directly at him, and this time there was no ambiguity in her expression. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't miscommunication. It was a conclusion, resolute and immovable. She told him flatly that he should go ask someone else to exchange seats because she had no intention of moving. The words suspended themselves in the recycled cabin air between them, unmistakable and cutting. Behind Jonathan, the procession of passengers had ground to a complete halt. He could detect the murmuring beginning, the restless shuffling of feet, the exasperated sighs of travelers who simply wanted to reach their destinations. A man somewhere in the queue behind him called out, inquiring what the delay was about. Jonathan felt warmth ascending in his face, not from rage, but from the acute consciousness that he'd become the unwilling focal point of a scene, that everyone in the adjacent rows was observing this absurd confrontation. He wasn't oblivious. He comprehended precisely what was transpiring here, could interpret it in the way she'd assessed him, in the way she'd arranged her body as an obstruction, in the inflection of her voice when she declared she wasn't moving. This wasn't about window seat preferences. This wasn't about legroom or personal comfort. This was about the fact that Melissa Hightower had observed a black man in an olive jacket approaching her row and had rendered an instantaneous judgment that she didn't want him occupying the seat beside her for the duration of this flight. She'd selected the most passive-aggressive tactic available to her, simply refusing to budge, converting her physical presence into a blockade, compelling him either to create a public spectacle or to quietly capitulate and locate another seat elsewhere. Jonathan stood there, gripping his portfolio bag, his boarding pass slightly creased in his hand. He could sense the attention of other passengers focused on him, could perceive the mounting frustration of the people trapped behind him in the aisle. Part of him was tempted to simply walk away, to locate a flight attendant and discreetly explain the situation to prevent escalating this further than it already had. But another part of him, the part that was bone-weary and had paid for that window seat and possessed every legitimate right to occupy it, refused to retreat. He addressed her again, his voice controlled but strained, reiterating that this was his assigned seat and that she needed to permit him to pass. Melissa's jaw tightened visibly. She averted her gaze from him, returning to her phone, as if by disregarding his presence, she could somehow erase him from existence. Her legs remained stretched across the aisle, an undeniable physical obstruction. She offered no response, which was somehow more offensive than another explicit refusal. The murmuring behind Jonathan was intensifying. Someone requested that they please continue moving. Another voice questioned what exactly was happening up ahead. Jonathan felt caught between his row and the increasingly impatient passengers accumulating behind him. He scanned the cabin, searching for a flight attendant, and finally identified one near the galley area assisting with overhead luggage. As if detecting the disturbance, the flight attendant, a man in his early 40s named Marcus, wearing the airline's crisp uniform and an expression of practiced professionalism, began navigating his way down the aisle. He moved through the stalled line of passengers with the efficiency of someone who'd managed countless similar situations. His eyes were already evaluating the scene before him. When he reached row 14, he looked at Jonathan, then at Melissa, then at the conspicuously empty seats beside Melissa, and Jonathan could observe him mentally assembling the pieces of what was occurring. He inquired pleasantly if there was a problem, though his tone carried an undertone of authority that indicated he already suspected there was. Jonathan gestured toward the window seat and explained that this was his assigned seat, that he was simply attempting to access it, but that she was refusing to move to allow him passage. The flight attendant's focus shifted to Melissa, who continued to studiously examine her phone. He stated clearly that if this gentleman had been assigned the window seat, she would need to allow him to reach it, instructing her to please stand or reposition herself so he could get by. Melissa looked up, and her expression had transformed into something defensive. She announced that she wasn't comfortable with the current arrangement, her voice taking on an edge that suggested she expected this declaration to settle the matter. Jonathan Hammond's week had been relentless. 5 days across 3 different cities, each morning beginning before sunrise, each evening ending long after most people had finished dinner. Monday in Chicago, a 7 a.m. presentation to a room full of skeptical executives who needed convincing that his firm's consulting approach was worth their investment. Tuesday in Minneapolis, back-to-back strategy sessions that stretched from breakfast through a working lunch and into a dinner meeting where he'd smiled through another round of questions he'd already answered twice that day. Wednesday brought him to Detroit, where a client workshop ran until nearly 9 p.m., followed by 2 hours of prep work in his hotel room for Thursday's follow-up session. By Thursday afternoon, as he'd wrapped his final presentation and fielded the last round of handshakes and business card exchanges, Jonathan had felt the cumulative weight of the week settling into every muscle. The early wake-up calls, the constant performance mode, the mental gymnastics of reading rooms and adjusting his approach on the fly, the careful navigation of being professionally assertive without triggering anyone's discomfort. It had all extracted its toll. The flight home wasn't just transportation. It was the finish line. 3 hours of enforced stillness where nobody could ask him another question, request another revision, or expect him to be on. When he'd booked the ticket 2 weeks earlier, he'd paused at the seat selection screen. The standard seat was free. The window seat cost an additional $35. For a moment, he'd considered saving the money. It was just a seat, after all. But then he'd imagined himself finally aboard that plane, exhausted, desperately needing to disconnect, and he'd clicked the upgrade. $35 for a guaranteed spot to rest his head. $35 for a barrier against the aisle traffic. $35 for 3 uninterrupted hours of peace. After the week he knew he'd have, it felt less like an indulgence and more like a necessity. A small luxury he'd earned through 5 days of hotel coffee, recycled presentation air, and the particular exhaustion that comes from being perpetually professional. That window seat was supposed to be his reward, his sanctuary, his 3 hours of deserved rest before returning to real life. The gate agent's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing boarding for Zone 2. Jonathan gathered his portfolio bag, double-checked that his phone was securely in his jacket pocket, and joined the line forming at the jet bridge entrance. The familiar rhythm of air travel took over. Scan the boarding pass, hear the confirming beep, step onto the jet bridge where the temperature always seemed to hover somewhere between uncomfortably warm and slightly stifling. He moved with the steady flow of passengers, that peculiar shuffle-step pace where everyone's in a hurry but nobody can actually move any faster than the person in front of them. The jet bridge stretched ahead, slightly inclined, smelling of jet fuel and industrial carpet. Through the windows, he could see the aircraft's white fuselage, the airline logo gleaming in the afternoon sun. Stepping through the aircraft door, Jonathan felt that subtle shift in air quality. The recycled atmosphere unique to planes, slightly pressurized, carrying the scent of cleaning products and the ghost of 1,000 previous flights. He offered a polite nod to the flight attendant stationed at the entrance, her smile practiced but genuine enough, then turned down the aisle. His eyes automatically began scanning the row numbers overhead. Row 5, row 6, row 7. He sidestepped a man struggling to hoist a roller bag into an overhead bin, continued past a family with a toddler already expressing loud opinions about the situation, navigated around a woman blocking the aisle while she methodically arranged items in the seat pocket. Row 10, row 11, row 12. The aisle stretched ahead, and Jonathan could feel anticipation building despite his exhaustion. Just a few more rows. Just a few more minutes until he could finally sink into that window seat. Row 13 came into view, and then, just ahead, row 14. His row. Jonathan's eyes traveled to the seats, and he registered what he was seeing. The window seat empty and waiting, the middle seat vacant, but the aisle seat occupied. A blonde woman in a cream sweater, already settled in, her attention focused on something in her lap. He continued forward, his grip tightening slightly on his bag's leather strap, ready to excuse himself past her and claim his window seat. As Jonathan drew closer to row 14, the full picture came into focus, and what he'd initially registered as a woman simply settled in her seat revealed itself as something more deliberate. Melissa hadn't just taken her assigned aisle seat. She'd colonized the entire row with the calculated precision of someone staking territorial claim. Her designer handbag, one of those oversized leather affairs with prominent gold hardware and a logo that announced its price point, sat squarely in the middle seat. Not tucked apologetically to one side, not positioned to be easily moved, but centered on the cushion as if it were a passenger in its own right. Her jacket, a lightweight blazer in a coordinating cream shade, was draped across the back of that same middle seat, the sleeves arranged just so. Together, the items created a clear buffer zone, a physical manifestation of occupied that had nothing to do with actual occupation. But it was Melissa's body language that completed the picture. She'd angled herself in the aisle seat in a way that maximized her presence. Her shoulders turned slightly toward the aisle. One leg crossed over the other with her foot extending into the walkway. Her posture radiated a particular kind of comfort, the comfort of someone who'd decided this space was hers and had no expectation of sharing it. She held her phone at an angle that kept her gaze directed downward, away from the boarding passengers passing by, away from any potential eye contact that might invite interaction. Jonathan slowed his pace as he reached the row, taking in the scene. This wasn't the casual sprawl of someone who'd simply settled in early and would naturally adjust when their seatmate arrived. This was strategic positioning. Every element, the prominently placed bag, the draped jacket, the angled body, the deliberate avoidance of eye contact, communicated a single, unmistakable message. This row is full. Other passengers continued to press forward behind him, and Jonathan became aware that he was creating an obstruction. He shifted his portfolio bag from one shoulder to the other, cleared his throat quietly, and prepared to navigate what should have been the simplest part of boarding, asking someone to move so he could reach his assigned seat. Jonathan positioned himself at the edge of row 14, maintaining what he hoped was a non-threatening distance, and offered a polite smile. "Excuse me," he said, his voice friendly and measured. "I have the window seat." Melissa's eyes flicked up from her phone for the briefest moment. Her gaze landed somewhere in the vicinity of his chest, never quite reaching his face, and then returned immediately to her screen. Her thumb continued its rhythmic scrolling. She said nothing. Her body remained exactly as it had been, angled possessively in the aisle seat, her designer bag still occupying the middle seat like a silent sentry, her legs still forming a barrier to the row. Jonathan waited a beat, expecting the natural follow-up. An apology, a shift of the bag, a retraction of legs to allow him passage. None came. Behind him, he could hear the shuffle of footsteps slowing, passengers beginning to bunch up in the aisle. He tried again, this time holding up his boarding pass so she could see the seat assignment printed clearly. 14A. "This is my seat," he said, tapping the boarding pass for emphasis. The window. Melissa glanced up again, and this time her eyes actually met his for a fraction of a second before sliding away. She made a small sound, something between a sigh and an exhale, and shifted slightly in her seat. But the shift wasn't to accommodate him. It was the opposite. She settled herself more deeply into the aisle seat, her shoulders squaring, her crossed leg adjusting to a more comfortable position. Her handbag remained untouched in the middle seat. Her jacket stayed draped across the seat back. The sigh had been performative, theatrical, a display of mild irritation at being disturbed rather than acknowledgement that she needed to move. She returned her full attention to her phone, scrolling with slightly more deliberate focus, as if Jonathan weren't standing right there, as if his boarding pass weren't still raised between them, as if the entire situation would resolve itself through her sheer determination to ignore it. Jonathan felt the first flicker of something beyond confusion. This wasn't miscommunication. This was refusal. Clear, deliberate, unmistakable refusal. The passengers behind Jonathan were no longer just slowing. They'd stopped completely. He could feel their presence accumulating, could hear the subtle shifts of weight from foot to foot, the quiet murmurs of confusion about the holdup. The pressure of their collective impatience pressed against his back like a physical force. Jonathan lowered his boarding pass but kept his voice steady, though he could feel tension creeping into his shoulders. "I need to get to my seat," he said, more firmly this time. "Could you please move your things?" Melissa's thumb stopped mid-scroll. For a long moment, she remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on her phone screen. Then, slowly, deliberately, she looked up at him. This time she held his gaze, and her expression had transformed from studied indifference to something harder, more resolute. "That's my seat," she said flatly, her voice loud enough to carry beyond their immediate space. "Find another one." The words landed in the recycled cabin air like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples of awareness through the surrounding rows. Jonathan felt the shift immediately, the sudden cessation of nearby conversations, the turning of heads, the redirect of attention. Passengers who'd been occupied with stowing bags or settling into their seats paused mid-motion, their curiosity piqued by the unusual confrontation. A woman across the aisle stopped arranging items in her seat pocket and looked over. 2 rows back, a businessman lowered his phone. Even the family with the restless toddler had gone quiet, the parents exchanging glances as they registered what was happening. Jonathan stood frozen, his boarding pass still clutched in his hand, aware that he'd become the unwilling center of a scene he'd never wanted to create. The exhaustion from his week suddenly felt heavier, compounded now by the acute consciousness that dozens of eyes were watching, waiting to see what he would do next. Marcus had been monitoring the boarding process from his position near the forward galley when he noticed the flow of passengers grinding to a halt around row 14. 20 years with the airline had given him an instinct for trouble, and the particular quality of stillness in that section of the cabin. Passengers stopped mid-stride, heads turned toward something, triggered that instinct immediately. He moved down the aisle with practiced efficiency, his expression arranged in what the airline training manual called approachable authority. The smile on his face was professional, polite, but his eyes were already assessing the situation. A black man in business casual standing in the aisle with a boarding pass in hand, a blonde woman seated with her belongings spread across multiple seats, and the unmistakable tension of a confrontation in progress. "Good afternoon," Marcus said, his voice carrying the carefully calibrated warmth of someone who needed to de-escalate without taking sides too quickly. "Is there a problem here?" Jonathan turned toward him with visible relief. "Yes, I'm trying to get to my seat, 14A, but she won't let me through." Marcus's eyes moved to Melissa, who had returned her attention to her phone as if the flight attendant's arrival was irrelevant to her. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass, please?" Melissa looked up with an expression that suggested this was all terribly inconvenient. She reached into her bag and produced her boarding pass, holding it out without a word. Marcus examined both passes, though he'd already guessed what they would show. He kept his voice neutral, professional. "Sir, you're assigned to 14A, the window seat. Ma'am, you have 14C, which is the aisle seat you're currently in." He gestured to the empty window seat. "Ma'am, you'll need to move your belongings and allow this gentleman to access his assigned seat." The statement hung in the air, clear and non-negotiable, backed by airline policy and federal regulation. Melissa's carefully maintained composure fractured. Her jaw tightened, and she straightened in her seat, her voice taking on an edge that combined defensiveness with entitlement. "I'm not comfortable with this arrangement," she said, her words clipped and deliberate. "I paid good money for peace and quiet on this flight, and I have a right to feel safe." The surrounding passengers went absolutely still. Even without explicitly saying what made her uncomfortable, everyone understood. The subtext was crystal clear, hanging in the air like smoke. Marcus's expression changed. The professional smile vanished, replaced by something harder. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, shoulders squaring, chin lifting slightly, the transformation from accommodating service provider to authority figure complete. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had dropped half an octave, stripped of its earlier warmth. "Federal aviation regulations and airline policy are very clear. You cannot refuse to sit next to another passenger based on personal bias. Every person on this aircraft has paid for their assigned seat and has the right to occupy it without discrimination." Melissa's face flushed. "I'm not discriminating against anyone. I prefer to have space, and I was here first, and I don't see why." "Mom." Marcus cut her off, his tone brooking no argument. "You have two options. You can remain in your assigned seat, 14C, and allow Mr. Hammond to take his assigned seat, 14A, or you can choose to leave this aircraft. Those are your only choices." The ultimatum landed with absolute finality. Around them, passengers had stopped even pretending not to watch. Phones were being discreetly angled. A teenager 2 rows back had his camera pointed directly at the scene. Melissa looked from Marcus to Jonathan, then back to Marcus, her expression cycling through disbelief, indignation, and the dawning realization that she'd miscalculated badly. "You can't be serious," she said, but her voice had lost its certainty. Marcus waited exactly 5 seconds for Melissa to make her decision. When she sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing without producing words, he reached for the radio clipped to his belt. "This is Flight Attendant Marcus Chun requesting gate agent assistance at row 14. We have a passenger refusing to comply with seating policy." The radio crackled with an immediate response. "Copy that. Gate agent and security en route." Melissa's eyes widened. "Wait, no, that's not necessary. She looked around at the watching passengers as if seeking allies, but found only impassive faces and a few phones pointed in her direction. This is ridiculous. You're overreacting. Ma'am, you were given clear options, Marcus said, his voice steady. Within 2 minutes, a gate agent appeared at the aircraft door, followed by 2 airport security officers in dark uniforms. They moved down the aisle with purposeful strides, and Melissa's remaining composure crumbled entirely. "This is absurd," she said, her voice rising. "I'm a paying customer. You can't just, I have rights. I'll be calling corporate. This is discrimination against me." One of the security officers, a woman with graying hair and an expression of infinite patience, spoke quietly. "Ma'am, you need to gather your belongings and come with us." Melissa snatched her designer bag from the middle seat with shaking hands, grabbed her jacket, and stood abruptly. Her face was flushed crimson, tears of anger and humiliation brimming in her eyes. As the officers flanked her and began guiding her toward the front of the aircraft, someone in the back rows started clapping. Others joined in. Not a roar of applause, but a scattered, pointed acknowledgement. "Mommy, why is that lady leaving?" a child's voice piped up. Melissa kept her eyes straight ahead as she walked the gauntlet of phones and stares, her earlier confidence replaced by rigid mortification. The walk down that aisle would last less than 30 seconds, but Jonathan suspected she'd remember every step. The aisle cleared. The murmuring subsided. Marcus gestured toward row 14 with a slight nod, and Jonathan finally moved forward, sliding his portfolio bag under the seat in front of 14A before lowering himself into the window seat he'd paid $35 for. The seat he'd been anticipating for the past hour, the seat that should have been the easiest thing in the world to claim. The entire row stretched empty beside him now. 3 seats of solitude that felt less like a victory and more like the aftermath of a battle he'd never wanted to fight. Jonathan leaned forward and pressed his forehead against the small oval window, feeling the cool plastic against his skin. Outside, ground crew members moved with purposeful efficiency around the aircraft, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded inside. The plane's engines hummed to life, and Jonathan felt the subtle shift as the aircraft began its pushback from the gate. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, trying to release the tension that had coiled in his shoulders and jaw. "Hey!" The voice came from across the aisle. Jonathan looked over to see a middle-aged man giving him a simple thumbs up, a gesture of solidarity that needed no words. Jonathan managed a small nod in return. Moments later, Marcus appeared beside his row, holding a bottle of water. He placed it on Jonathan's tray table without fanfare. "I'm sorry you had to experience that," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier authority, now just human to human. "It shouldn't have happened." "Thank you," Jonathan said, and meant it. Marcus moved on to complete his pre-flight checks, and Jonathan opened the water bottle, taking a long drink. He leaned back against his hard-won window seat and closed his eyes again. The system had worked this time, the policies had been enforced, the right outcome had been reached. But the victory felt exhausting, bittersweet, and tinged with the knowledge that he'd had to fight for something that should have simply been his.